Let's take a look at Python's built-in data structures. We're going to look at ints, which are integers, floats, which are floating point. They are a representation of the real numbers. Sometimes people refer to them as decimals. They have a decimal point in them. And strings, which is a collection of characters, actually a collection of characters strung together. There's a nice little function called type that will tell us the type of things. So if we have type of an int2, it tells us that it's an int. If we have the type of a decimal, we see that is float. And if we have type of something that is in quotes, which is a string, we see that is a type str, which means string. Earlier we saw that we can take an expression like 2 plus 3. Now we know those as ints. And the result will be the number 5. And we can check the type of y and see that its type is int. If, on the other hand, I took a couple of floats, decimal numbers if you prefer, and when I add those together and we print it, we see we get a number such as 5.3. And now, because we have assigned some floats to the y, we see that the type of y is now a float. In a similar manner, if I could take a variable, assign it to be a string, and when I check the type of that variable, we see that it is type string. Now, let's take a look at division. Division is a little dicey. Division of ints, that is. We saw before that if we took 8 divided by 2, we get 4. That's fine. Nothing very interesting there. But let's take a look at 7 divided by 2, and we get a 3. You might have been expecting 3.5, but what happens when I have the division of 2 ints, we're really getting just the quotient, not the remainder, because we want to get an integer as a result. If I want the remainder, we use a symbol that's got a slash in it. Percent's got a little slash in it. Looks a little bit like a division symbol. And that will give us the remainder. If I, in fact, want 3.5, then I can use 2 floating point values, and that will give me floating point division, which now gives me a floating point result, and we get the 3.5 that might be what is desired. This looks a little strange. There actually is, it makes sense in terms of mathematics. If you take, there's this notion of closure. If you add 2 integers, you get an integer. Subtract 2 integers, you get an integer. Multiply 2 integers, you get an integer. But if you divide 2 integers, that's actually a rational number. It's no longer an integer. But the quotient of 2 integers is an integer, and the remainder, when you do division of 2 integers, is an integer. So we see that same thing reflected here in the arithmetic in Python, and in fact in most programming languages. So if you want a 3.5, you got to do floating point division. If you have something like 7 divided by 2, but what you really want is the 3.5, just make one of the numbers a floating point. Python and other languages will convert both of them to floating point, and in fact you will get the 3.5 that you wanted. So the 7 divided by 2.0 really gets converted to 7.0 divided by 2.0. And not surprisingly, if I just converted the 7 to a float, then I did division, I would get the 3.5. So got to watch out a little bit. Division by integers, and the one that will really get you is something like this: 1 divided by 2. How many times does 2 go into 1? Well, in fact, the quotient is 0. So if all of a sudden zeros start showing up in your program when you didn't expect them, you might look to see whether you were getting a quotient instead of instead of getting the floating point value that you might have been wanting. Let's take a look at strings. That we can assign a string to a variable. Strings can be represented with either single or double quotes. You just have to use the same in the same string. You can't have a single quote at one end and a double quote at the other end. Addition is allowed. That's actually concatenation, so it will just slap them together. So I get this funny looking hello world. If I want a space in between, I can add a space. There's a space, two quotes with a space in between, and now I get something that's a little more readable. Hello world. Notice it has quotes. If I do a print of the exact same expression, I find that we get hello world without the quotes. Notice here that even though I've done that arithmetic on the string, the two strings x and y themselves have not changed. There is one other piece of arithmetic that we can do with strings, and that's multiplication, which it just does repetition. So 3 times x, where x is hello, gives me hello, hello, hello. So very briefly, we have looked at the 3 types of built-in data types: the ints, which are integers; floats, which are representations of the real numbers; and then strings, which are strings of characters represented with quotes. That's it.